Wyoming Territory, July 1879, the wind howled low across the dry earth as the westbound train exhaled steam and screeched to a stop in the dust-choked town of Willow Creek. Nella Hartley stepped off that train barefoot. Her shoes had been taken in Kansas City, traded for food after the last of her coins were stolen in St. Louis. Her dress was torn at the hem, her bonnet limp from days of sun and wind and grit. She stood on the platform, blinking against the bright sun, clutching the crumpled letter she had read so many times the ink had started to fade. It was a proposal from a man named Thomas Lyle, a rancher in Willow Creek who'd written in neat, careful hand, "You will be safe with me. A warm bed, a steady roof, and kindness, I offer you all that." She had believed him. But when she stepped forward and introduced herself, a man with a sharp chin and cold eyes looked her up and down, then shook his head. "You best get back on that train," he muttered. "I changed my mind." Nella stared at him, stunned. "You, what?" "I expected a lady, not someone who shows up looking like a beggar." "I walked the last 20 miles, she said, voice barely holding steady. "I ran out of fare. I did not come for your money. I came for a life. You won't find it here." He turned and walked away, the platform emptied. The train hissed, then rolled forward, leaving her behind. Nella stood barefoot on the wooden boards, her feet raw, her throat dry. Her hand trembled as she pressed the letter to her chest. She had nowhere to go, no one waited for her. Not a soul in this town even knew her name, except one pair of eyes had watched it all. Elam Carter leaned against the hitch rail across the street, arms crossed, dust clinging to his boots and hat. He had been hauling fence posts all morning, but when he saw her standing there alone, barefoot, trying to keep herself upright with what pride she had left, something in his chest shifted. He crossed the street before he even realized what he was doing. "You all right, miss?" he asked gently. Nella stiffened and angled away from him, wiping her cheek with the back of her hand. "I am fine. You do not look it. I am not your concern." Elam crouched to peer at her face, and when she looked at him, she saw something different, no pity, just calm, steady kindness. "I am not trying to insult you, just seems like you were left high and dry." Nella exhaled shakily. "He changed his mind, said I looked like a beggar." Lamb's jaw tightened. "You walked barefoot to get here. It was that or starve." He nodded slowly, then looked down at her feet. "You need a place to sit and water. Come on, my horse is tied just there." "I am not going with you." "I am not offering anything improper," he said, voice still calm. "Just a clean place to rest. My cabin is a few miles out. I got a spare room and no wife to mind it." She hesitated. "Why would you help me?" "Because someone ought to." Nella looked at him a long moment. He had a strong build, wide shoulders, and a quiet way about him, like he did not need to say much to mean what he said. Something about him felt safe, even if she did not trust herself to hope for that yet. She nodded once. Lamb helped her onto his horse, then climbed up behind her. His arms never touched her, though he kept one hand lightly on the reins and the other close in case she slipped. They rode in silence through the dry hills and low brush, the wind brushing her face. His cabin sat beside a narrow creek, shaded by cottonwoods. It was small but solid, with a porch and a clothesline and a stack of chopped wood. A dog barked once from under the porch, then wagged its tail as they approached. Elam dismounted, then helped her down, careful not to touch her unless she asked. Inside, the cabin smelled like pine and bread. He fetched a basin and some cloths, set them by a chair, and brought her a cup of water. "You can wash up while I fix something to eat," he said. "There is a blanket in the chest if you get cold." Nella sat slowly, her body aching. When he stepped out to chop more wood, she let herself cry for the first time since the train left Missouri. That night, she slept in the spare room. Elam never crossed the threshold. In the morning, he left a pair of boots by the door. They were too big, but they were clean. "I will work," she said as she sat on the porch with him that evening. "I can sew or cook, or you do not owe me anything." "I do," he looked at her. "Then rest." "That is payment enough for now." Days passed. She helped him tend the garden, fed the chickens, cleaned the cabin. Her hands healed. Her color returned. She laughed once at a joke he made about the rooster, and the sound startled them both. One afternoon, she found a new pair of boots by her door. They fit. Weeks passed. The sun warmed her skin. Her smile came easier. Elam never asked for her past and she never asked for his. But in the quiet, in the shared chores and long rides to town, they learned each other. He listened to her, watched her. Brought her wildflowers when he found them near the edge of his grazing land. She began watching for him when he was late from the range. Then, one evening, as they stood by the creek watching the orange sky fade to dusk, Nella said quietly, "You saved me." Elam looked down at the water. "I just offered a place to rest." "No," she said. "You saw me when I thought no one would." He turned to face her. "I saw a woman who deserved better than what she was given." Tears welled up in her eyes. "You gave me a home." His voice was low. "You made it feel like one." She stepped closer, her hand brushing his. He took it slowly, like he was afraid she might pull away. She did not when their lips met. It was soft, sure, and full of warmth that had been building between them like a fire banked in coals. Neither of them said the word love that night. They did not need to. It was already there. The cottonwoods had turned silver in the breeze by the time Nella reached the barn that evening, arms full of feed sacks. Inside, the light slanted low across the rafters, picking up dust in the air like floating threads. Elam was knee-deep in straw, checking the back leg of a roan filly who'd come up lame that morning. "She favorin' it still?" Nella asked, setting the sacks down without disturbing the quiet. He nodded, brushing sweat from his brow with the back of his wrist. "A touch better, but not near sound. I'll poultice her tonight. Want help? I'd take it." She folded her sleeves and knelt beside him, careful not to spook the horse. The animal flicked her ears but didn't shy. Nella worked the cloth gently, pressing it into the damp clay Elam had mixed. When she leaned over to wrap the leg, he steadied her elbow with his hand, nothing more than a touch, but it settled something in her chest she hadn't known was still loose. Afterward, they walked back toward the cabin without speaking. The sun had dropped low, and the air held the scent of sage and creek water. Elam paused near the edge of the porch and looked toward the hills. "Found signs of elk this morning, just past the ridge," he said. "Tracks and droppings both." She followed his gaze. "You planning a hunt, come fall, maybe, if I can get the fencing done up past the north slope before snow?" "I could help with that," she said, brushing her hands on her skirt, his brow lifted. "You ever stretch fence line?" "No, but I've stitched seams that held through Kansas wind. Can't be too different." He gave a quiet chuckle, the first she'd heard from him. "I reckon that's fair." They sat on the porch after supper, not touching, not talking much, but sharing the stillness. Nella held a needle in her hand, darning one of her old stockings, and Elam whittled a piece of cedar, curling shavings onto the step. The dog lay between them, twitching in sleep. "Why Wyoming?" he asked finally, his voice low. She didn't answer right away. The question floated there, not heavy, just waiting. "My sister died in Illinois," she said at last. "Last winter, fever took her in 2 days. After that, there wasn't anything left to keep me. I tried staying with her husband's people, but they had 7 mouths already. I figured if I was going to be alone, I might as well choose where." Elam nodded slowly, not pushing for more. "You," she asked, born near Fort Bridger. "Spent time up north, then came back when my father passed. He left the land to me, never married. Always figured I would if it happened on its own." "Not much happens on its own," she said, laying her mended stocking over the rail to dry. "No," he agreed. "But sometimes it's better that way." She didn't respond, but she stayed beside him until the stars came out, her shoulder nearly brushing his. The next morning, Elam saddled both horses. Nella stepped out with her hair braided tight and a canteen slung over her shoulder. "We riding fence?" she asked, something like that. He led her toward the ridge, past the far paddock where the grass grew taller and the trail narrowed into shale. They rode single file for a stretch, the sound of hooves and birdsong filling the space. When they crested the ridge, the valley opened up below, wide and untouched, the creek winding silver through the cottonwoods. Elam dismounted first and offered his hand. "Thought you might want to see the rest of it." She took his hand and stepped down. The grass was warm under her boots, the air sharp with pine. "This is yours," she asked. "Ours if you want it." She turned to him. He didn't speak again, didn't push, just waited, steady as ever. Nella looked out over the land. "Hills, sky, water, a place to belong, I do," she said. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small tin box. Inside was a plain gold band. "I had this before I ever wrote to you," he said. "Didn't know who it was for, just kept it." She held out her hand. He slid the ring on her finger. They didn't kiss then, not yet. But they stood hand in hand, the wind lifting her braid, his thumb brushing hers, as the sun rose higher over the valley that would be their home. The wind changed in September, not with violence, but with a hush that swept through the cottonwoods and made the pine tops tilt westward. The days still held warmth, but in the mornings, Nella saw her breath curl faintly in the air as she stepped outside with kindling in her arms. She had begun rising before Elam, starting the fire while the cabin was still quiet, the dog asleep on the hearth and the light barely touching the sky. On one such morning she found him seated on the porch, already dressed, boots laced, hands idle. "You're up early," she said, surprised. "Couldn't sleep. The cattle's been uneasy, might be wolves near the bluff again." She nodded, setting the kindling into the hearth. "Want me to ride out with you?" "No, you stay and keep the smoke steady if I'm not back by sundown, light the lamp on the porch." She didn't ask why. She just watched him ride out, rifle slung across his back, his shoulders set with quiet purpose. He returned late, mud caked on his trousers, a scrape across one cheek. "Only tracks," he said, handing her the reins as she came out to meet him. "But they're fresh. I'll set traps tomorrow." She wet a cloth and touched it gently to his face. He didn't flinch, but his eyes softened. "That from a branch or a fall?" she asked. "Elk trail narrowed too sudden. Horse stumbled. I got lucky." She didn't say what she was thinking. That luck had little to do with it. Elam moved with care always. He didn't take chances. If he had been thrown, it was because something had startled the horse. And that meant whatever was out there wasn't moving on. She sewed a new patch onto his coat that night where the sleeve had torn. He watched her from the table, his hands resting around a mug of chicory. "That dress you came in," he said, voice low, "the one you had on when you first got here. What did you do with it?" She looked up from her stitching. "I burned it. It belonged to a life I don't live anymore." He nodded once, then glanced toward the chest near the wall. "I've got fabric." "My mother's. She used to sew in the winter, if you want it." "I'd like that." They didn't speak again for a while. He took his mug to the sink, rinsed it, and set it on the shelf. She folded the coat and placed it by the door. That night, Nella lay awake, listening to the wind. Elam's room was across the hall. She could hear the faint creak of his bed when he shifted. The dog stirred once, then settled again. The next day, Elam rode into town for salt blocks and nails. Nella stayed behind. She spent the morning in the garden, pulling the last of the beans and stacking them in a basket. The soil was dry, and the sun sat low even at midday. When she stood and stretched her back, she caught sight of smoke rising far off, beyond the ridge. By the time Elam returned, her hands were stained from husks and her cheeks flushed from worry. "There's fire," she said before he even dismounted. He squinted toward the hills. "That's south. Could be someone clearing brush. It's thick back there. I'll check it come morning. I'll go with you." He didn't argue. That night they sat at the table longer than usual. She mended a saddle strap while he cleaned his rifle, the lamp between them flickering gold against the walls. "Do you ever miss company?" she asked, not looking up. "You mean town?" "No, people, neighbors, more than just us." He set the cloth aside. "I did once, when I first came back, but not now." She glanced at him. "Why not now?" "Because you're here." She didn't speak. Instead, she stood, walked to the hearth, and added wood to the fire. Then, without turning, she said, "Would you mind if I moved my things into your room?" He stood as well, not rushed, not uncertain, just sure. "You're welcome there," he said. They didn't close the door that night. The firelight touched the walls and their joined hands rested between them on the quilt. In the morning, they rode south with the sun behind them. The smoke was gone, but the scent lingered faintly in the air. They found a scorched patch of brush, blackened but cold. Elam dismounted and crouched to touch the ash. "Old," he said. "No sign of spread." Nella watched the tree line. "Could have been someone passing through." "Maybe." He stood again, brushing his hands. "Nothing to chase." They lingered there for a moment, then turned for home. On the way back, she asked, "What did your mother sew?" "Mostly shirts, curtains once. She never liked idle hands." "Mine made quilts, every piece from something lived in." He glanced at her then. What would you piece together now? She smiled faintly. A bit of porch light, that creek. The patch on your sleeve. He reached over and touched her knee lightly, just once. That'd be a fine quilt. By the time they reached the cabin, the wind had shifted again, cooler now, a promise of frost. They unloaded the horses, stacked wood by the door, and went inside. When Elam lit the lamp, Nella took his hand and led him to the chest beside the wall. Let's see that fabric, she said. They opened it together. Inside were folded calicos, soft from age. She ran her fingers over them, then looked up. I'll make something for winter, she said. For both of us, he nodded, brushing a curl from her forehead. Whatever you make, it'll last. She leaned into him, her voice barely a whisper. So will we. By the first frost, Nella had finished the winter shirts, 2 of them, one in a deep blue with narrow ticking stripes, the other in a russet brown that reminded her of sun-warmed earth. She stitched their initials onto the inside hems, small and neat, though she didn't tell Elam. He found them himself one evening, running a thumb across the thread as he folded his clean laundry. Didn't expect you to go signing my clothes, he said with a quiet tilt of his mouth. You didn't expect a lot of things, she replied, not looking up from the onions she was slicing. He rolled the shirt once more and tucked it away. No, I didn't. They didn't talk about the future in broad strokes. No big plans, no declarations. But she'd noticed he'd begun fencing the west slope even before the east was finished. And when he found a second chair in town, he carried it home tied behind the saddle without a word. One morning in late October, she caught him standing outside the barn, staring down the road that led to the town post. The dog sat beside him, ears forward. Expecting someone, she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. Letter came last week, he said, from a man I knew in Bozeman. He's bringing a pair of colts through, might trade if one's steady enough. She stepped beside him, watching the road. You thinking of selling one of ours? No, thinking of training one over the winter. Might be time to take on more land. She looked up at him. You mean to hire help? No. I mean I could do more if I had someone to ride with regular. I've been riding with you, I know. He paused. That's what I mean. The wagon arrived 2 days later. The trader, a compact man with a stiff gait and a wide hat, brought 3 young horses, 2 bays, and a red roan with a blaze across the face. The red caught Elam's eye first, but it was the smaller bay that Nella stepped toward. He's watching me, she said, holding her hand out. He's young, he's calm. The trader leaned on the rail. She's got an eye, that one's been handled gentle, might take to a woman better than a man. Elam studied the horse, then studied her. You want him? He asked. I'd like to try. They traded a saddled mule and a stack of grain sacks. The bay stayed. They called him Jasper. By November, Nella was up before dawn, riding Jasper along the creek bed while Elam worked the pasture line. She'd taken to carrying the smaller rifle, the one he'd shortened for her hands. She didn't like using it, but she liked knowing how. One evening, after the sun had dropped and the barn was shut, Elam came in with his sleeves damp and his hair windblown. She was kneading dough by the stove, her hands dusted with flour. Got a letter, he said, setting the envelope on the table. She wiped her palms and picked it up. Your handwriting. I wrote it last week, wasn't sure if I'd send it. She set it down, waiting. It's to the circuit preacher. Asking him to stop by before the snow locks up the ridge, her breath caught. You want to be married before winter? I want to be married to you. Winter's just a season. Her hands still smelled of yeast and salt when she reached for his, warm and calloused. Then write him again, she said. Tell him yes. Tell him soon. They were married under the cottonwoods with the preacher's wife bearing witness and the dog lying curled in the grass nearby. Elam wore the blue shirt she'd made, and she wore a dress sewn from his mother's fabric, the bodice stitched with a row of tiny buttons he'd carved from bone. There was no music, but the wind moved the trees like a hymn. After the vows, she didn't cry. She only held his hand and said, I wasn't meant to come here the way I did, but I was meant to come to you. He nodded, his voice low. You came the way you had to. And you stayed. That night, as snow began to fall in whispering flakes, they stood by the hearth, wrapped in a quilt she'd pieced from scraps gathered that autumn. You warm enough? He asked, his fingers brushing her cheek. She leaned into him. Warmer than I've ever been. Outside, the land quieted under white. Inside, they held each other, not like people clinging to what they feared to lose, but like those who had already found what they needed and meant to keep it. The first hard freeze came early in December, splitting the ground and crusting the creek's edges in brittle lace. Nella moved slower that week, her belly beginning to round beneath her wool coat. Elam noticed, though she hadn't said anything aloud yet. He came in from the barn with straw in his beard and watched her stir the pot at the stove. "You've been rising later," he said without judgment. She kept her eyes on the bubbling broth. "I meant to tell you." I wasn't sure how soon it would show. He crossed the room and touched her waist, not possessive, just gentle. "I figured, you've been holding your middle when you sleep." She nodded, lips parted in quiet surprise. "I didn't realize. I watch you," he said. "Always have." They didn't celebrate, not in the way folks in town might, but that evening he brought in the last of the dried apples and set them on the table with a tin of molasses she hadn't seen in months. "We'll make a pie," he said, setting out the flour. "I want the baby to know sweetness." Nella laughed softly, pulling her hair back with a ribbon. "You think they can taste through me? I think what you feel passes through." Winter pressed down hard in the weeks that followed. Snow climbed past the window ledges, and the stove burned near constant. Elam braced the roof beams and insulated the barn walls with extra wool sacks. Nella stayed in, sewing when her hands allowed, resting when the ache in her back pulled her down. One morning, while the wind howled low and the dog refused to leave the hearth, Nella found Elam at the table with a folded map and a pencil. He'd drawn lines through the grazing fields and marked small squares near the creek bend. "What's this?" she asked, easing into the chair beside him. "Thinking ahead," he said. "There's room for another cabin if we ever need." She traced the penciled square with one finger. "You want to break off land already, not break off," he said. "Build out. If we raise more than one child, they'll need space when they're grown." She smiled, warmth rising through her. "You're already thinking of them grown. I think of you old too," he said, meeting her gaze. "Still sitting here, still stitching, still arguing with me about how much salt to use." She leaned forward and kissed his cheek, her breath warming his skin. "Then I'll make sure to stay sharp enough to win those arguments." They passed the winter in quiet rhythm. Elam read aloud some nights, old books his mother had left behind, and Nella rested with her feet propped on a stool, eyes half-lidded, listening. Other nights they sat close by the fire, her fingers in his hair, his hand on her knee, saying nothing but feeling everything. When the thaw finally came in late March, it brought with it a rush of meltwater and the first green shoots pushing through the softened dirt. Elam dug new irrigation grooves near the back field, and Nella began laying out seeds, one hand on her belly, the other steady in the soil. By May, she'd grown heavy and luminous, her steps slower but still sure. Elam built a cradle from pine, carving their initials into the side. He sanded it smooth, oiled it with care, and set it by the bedroom window where the light came in softest in the morning. They didn't speak much about the birth, neither feared it aloud, though both carried the weight of it quietly. Nella had seen women survive it and women not. Elam had known both outcomes too. But when the time came, under a sky split by summer lightning, he didn't flinch, he boiled water. He held her hand. When the pain took her voice, he steadied her shoulders, and when their daughter slipped into the world in the hush just before dawn, he caught her in his own hands. She was red and wailing and strong. Nella wept, not from pain now, but from something deeper, a breaking open that came with the first breath of a new soul. "What shall we call her?" she asked, her head resting on Elam's chest as he cradled the child. He looked down at the tiny face, the dark lashes fluttering against damp cheeks. "I was thinking Laurel," he said. "Strong but soft." Nella nodded. "Laurel Hartley Carter, it fits." They raised her under the cottonwoods, with the creek singing nearby and the hills standing watch. Elam carried her in the crook of his arm while he checked fence lines. Nella sang to her while hanging laundry, her voice low and steady. The dog guarded her bassinet like a second cradle. Years passed. They built a second cabin, just as Elam had drawn. Eventually, they added a second child, a boy with quiet eyes like his father. They named him Elias. He took to the horses before he could walk steady and wore his sister's hand-me-down boots without complaint. Nella taught them both to read by the hearth, and Elam taught them to watch the weather, to respect the land, to honor silence when it spoke louder than words. By the time the children were grown, the homestead had doubled in size. Neighbors came now, not many, but enough that the field saw more than one set of footprints. Still, the heart of it remained what it had always been. Two people who had found each other not by luck, but by quiet, hard-earned grace. One evening, long after the children had gone to bed and the chores were done, Nella and Elam sat on the porch, watching the stars rise. Her hair had streaks of silver now, and his hands had grown slower, but when he reached for her, it was with the same sure touch. "You remember the day I arrived?" she asked. He didn't answer right away, just looked out over the land they'd built together. "I remember thinking you looked like you'd walked through fire," he said, "and I remember hoping you'd never have to again." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "I didn't," she said, "because you met me at the edge." He pressed a kiss to her temple, slow and certain. "And I'll keep meeting you. Wherever you are." The stars wheeled slowly overhead and the breeze swept gentle across the porch. Inside, Laurel stirred in her sleep. Elias shifted under his quilt. The dog, old now, still kept watch. And in the quiet of a Wyoming night, love settled deeper, rooted like the cottonwoods along the creek, enduring, quiet, and strong.